He was the man she could never have. She was the secret he could never keep. In the end, all forbidden love comes at a price. The rhythmic ticking of the clock echoed through the dimly lit office. It was almost midnight, and the city skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows shimmered with distant lights. The world was asleep, but inside Alexander Reed's office, tension crackled in the air like an unspoken confession. Sophia Carter sat at her desk, typing out the last few lines of a report. Her fingers moved mechanically, but her mind was elsewhere, on the man standing just a few feet away. Alexander, her boss, her CEO, a man wrapped in power and perfection. He was reviewing a document, sleeves rolled up, revealing strong forearms. The sharp cut of his suit only emphasized the dominance he exuded effortlessly. She swallowed hard. This wasn't the first time she felt it, this charged, forbidden attraction between them. It was in the way his eyes lingered on her just a second too long, the way their hands would brush during meetings, sending a shiver down her spine. "You should go home, Sophia." Alexander's deep, smooth voice broke the silence. "It's late." She looked up, meeting his gaze. Those stormy gray eyes, always unreadable yet undeniably intense, locked onto hers. "I don't mind staying," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. "You still have a lot to finish, and I'm here to assist you." A slow smirk tugged at his lips. Ever the dedicated secretary. She forced a smile, trying to ignore the heat crawling up her neck. "It's my job." He leaned back against his desk, arms crossed, studying her. "Is it just your job, Sophia?" Her breath hitched. There was something dangerous in his tone, something that made her stomach flutter and her skin tingle. She stood up quickly, grabbing a stack of files. "I should file these before I leave." She turned towards the cabinets, but before she could take a step, a strong hand caught her wrist. Her body froze, her pulse drumming wildly against her skin. Slowly, she turned back to face him. Alexander was close. Too close. She could feel the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of his cologne. Dark, intoxicating. His grip was gentle but firm, his thumb brushing against the sensitive skin of her wrist in a slow, deliberate motion. "Sophia," he murmured, his voice laced with something she couldn't decipher. Desire, restraint, a silent plea. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The space between them was suffocating, electrifying. His gaze flickered down to her lips, and for a moment, time stood still. Then, as if gravity itself pulled them together, his lips claimed hers. It was soft at first, a hesitant brush, testing, waiting. But the second she melted against him, his restraint shattered. He cupped her face, deepening the kiss, his other hand sliding around her waist, pulling her against him. A quiet gasp escaped her as her fingers found their way to his shirt, gripping the fabric like it was the only thing keeping her from falling. The office disappeared. The rules, the consequences, the risks, none of it mattered. All that existed was the intoxicating heat between them, the way his lips moved with desperate hunger, the way his hands roamed as if memorizing every inch of her. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. His fingers traced her jaw, his touch lingering. "This is dangerous," she whispered, her voice shaky. His lips curved into a wicked smirk. "I never played it safe, Sophia." And just like that, she knew this was only the beginning. The air between them remained heavy with unspoken words, lingering touches, and the undeniable heat that refused to dissipate. Sophia stood frozen, her heart pounding as Alexander slowly stepped back, allowing her space, just enough to breathe, but not enough to forget what had just happened. His lips were still slightly parted, his gaze locked onto her as if memorizing every detail of the moment. She had kissed her boss. No, he had kissed her, and she had let him. "I should go," she whispered, her voice barely steady. Alexander's jaw clenched, his fingers flexing at his sides as if restraining himself from reaching for her again. He nodded once, but there was something dangerous in his eyes, something that told her this wasn't over. Sophia turned on shaky legs, grabbed her bag, and hurried out of the office. The cool night air hit her like a slap when she stepped outside, but it did nothing to quell the heat simmering inside her. She needed to forget what happened. She needed to remind herself that this was a line they couldn't afford to cross. But deep down, she knew it was already too late. The next morning, Sophia walked into the office with a mask of professionalism firmly in place. She had spent the entire night tossing and turning, trying to convince herself that the kiss was a mistake, that they could go back to the way things were. But the moment she stepped into Alexander's office to deliver his schedule for the day, she knew she had been lying to herself. He was already there, seated behind his massive desk, his dark gray suit crisp, his expression unreadable. But the moment he looked up and met her gaze, something flickered in his eyes. Something she wasn't sure she could resist. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. His lips twitched, as if amused by her formality. "Good morning, Sophia." She set the folder on his desk, careful not to let her fingers brush against his. "Your meeting with the board is at 10, followed by a lunch appointment with Mr. Caldwell. I've also arranged for Sophia." Her breath caught. There was something about the way he said her name, slow and deliberate, that made her knees weak. She swallowed hard. "Yes, sir?" He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "About last night." Her pulse jumped. "It was a mistake," she cut in quickly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "We got caught up in the moment. It won't happen again." Alexander tilted his head, watching her with an intensity that made her stomach twist. "Is that what you really want?" "Yes." The word left her lips too fast, too forced. His smirk told her he wasn't convinced. "Very well," he said, leaning back. "If that's what you want." Relief washed over her, but only for a second. Because the way he looked at her, like a predator biding his time, told her he wasn't done with her. Not even close. That evening, Sophia found herself at an exclusive business dinner, seated beside Alexander at a private table in a luxurious restaurant. It was supposed to be a professional event, strictly business. But every time his arm brushed against hers, every time he leaned in to speak, the tension between them grew unbearable. Then, as they left the restaurant, the skies opened up. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, soaking through their clothes in seconds. "Damn it," Sophia muttered, hugging herself against the cold. "My penthouse is closer," Alexander said, already reaching for her hand. "Come with me." Her heart pounded as she hesitated. But when he looked at her, when his fingers tightened around hers, she knew there was no escaping him. Moments later, they stepped into his sleek, modern penthouse, rainwater dripping from their clothes. "You're soaked," Alexander murmured, his gaze dark and unreadable. "You should change." Before she could respond, he was already unbuttoning his shirt, revealing the sculpted perfection of his chest. She sucked in a breath, her fingers clenching into fists. "This isn't a good idea," she whispered. He stepped closer, tilting her chin up with a single finger. "Then tell me to stop." She opened her mouth, to protest, to say something, anything. But when his lips found hers again, when his hands gripped her waist, pulling her against him, all logic evaporated. The only thing that remained was desire. And this time, neither of them fought it. Sophia woke up to the warmth of sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's penthouse. The sheets tangled around her bare skin, the scent of him still lingering on her body. For a moment, she let herself bask in the afterglow, her fingers grazing the spot beside her where he had been just hours ago. But reality crashed in like a wave. "What have I done?" She sat up quickly, pulling the sheets around her as her heart pounded in her chest. Last night had been reckless, senseless. But the way Alexander had touched her, the way he had claimed her with his lips, his hands, his entire body, it had felt inevitable. The sound of water running in the bathroom pulled her attention. She exhaled sharply, forcing herself to think. She had to leave before this got even more complicated. Slipping out of bed, she searched for her dress from the night before, but before she could grab it, the bathroom door opened. Alexander stood there, a towel wrapped loosely around his hips, droplets of water sliding down his toned chest. His gaze met hers, dark and unreadable. "You're leaving," he said, not as a question but as a statement. Sophia swallowed hard. "I have to." He took slow, deliberate steps toward her, his presence filling the room, suffocating her in the most intoxicating way. "And what if I don't want you to?" Her breath caught. "Alexander." He reached for her, his fingers brushing against her bare shoulder before sliding down her arm. "You don't regret last night." His voice was low, seductive. "I can see it in your eyes." She squeezed her eyes shut. "This isn't about regret. It's about consequences." Alexander cupped her chin, forcing her to look at him. "Then let's deal with them together." Her pulse thundered. It would be so easy to give in again, to let herself drown in him. But she wasn't naive. This wasn't just a fling. This was dangerous. With a shaky breath, she stepped back, breaking his hold. "I need to go." His jaw tensed, but he didn't stop her this time. "I'll see you at the office." And just like that, she walked away, knowing full well that this wasn't the end. Back at work, Sophia tried to act as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Alexander was different. Subtle touches when no one was looking, lingering gazes across the conference table, the way his fingers brushed against hers when he handed her a file. It was like he was silently reminding her of what they had done, of what they could do again. And it was working. That afternoon, he called her into his office. She closed the door behind her, trying to steady her breath. "You needed me, sir?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. He stood from his desk and walked around to lean against it, arms crossed. "Lock the door." Her heart stuttered. "Alexander." "Lock it, Sophia." She hesitated for only a second before reaching back and turning the lock. The moment the sound clicked, Alexander was in front of her, his hands gripping her waist, pulling her flesh against him. "You've been avoiding me all day," he murmured, his lips dangerously close to hers. "We're at work," she whispered, her resolve slipping. "And that stops us from doing this?" He tilted her chin up and kissed her, slow, deep, and devastatingly possessive. Sophia melted against him, her hands fisting in his shirt. God, she was in trouble. Because she knew now she wasn't strong enough to resist him.
And she didn't want to.
Sophia knew this was madness. The way Alexander touched her, possessively, desperately, was nothing short of addictive. Every stolen moment, every heated glance, every forbidden kiss behind closed doors only pulled her deeper into a world where reason no longer existed. But the deeper she fell, the more dangerous this affair became. The days blurred into weeks. Sophia and Alexander perfected the art of secrecy, hushed conversations in dimly lit corridors, hands brushing under the table during meetings, late nights in his office, where passion ignited and rules ceased to matter. He would call her in for urgent matters, only to press her against the wall, his lips trailing down her neck as she tried, and failed, to stay quiet. They were reckless. And someone was starting to notice. One evening, as Sophia gathered her things to leave, she caught sight of Amelia Weston, Alexander's sharp-eyed executive assistant, watching her from across the office. "You've been spending a lot of time in Mr. Reed's office," Amelia said smoothly, her arms crossed. Sophia forced a smile. "It's my job." Amelia arched a brow. "Of course." She leaned in slightly. "Just be careful, Sophia. Office gossip can be ruthless." A chill ran down Sophia's spine. Was it a warning? A threat? Either way, it was a reminder. This wasn't just a passionate affair. This was a ticking time bomb. That night, Sophia paced in her apartment, her mind tangled in conflict. She needed to end this, before it destroyed her. A knock at her door made her stomach drop. She didn't need to guess who it was. When she opened the door, Alexander stood there, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it too many times. "You weren't answering my calls," he said, stepping inside without invitation. "I was thinking," she murmured, hugging her arms to her chest. Alexander studied her, his expression darkening. "Thinking about what?" She swallowed hard. About us. About how dangerous this is. A muscle ticked in his jaw. So what? You want to stop? Sophia's silence was enough of an answer. His eyes flashed with something raw, something almost desperate. You don't mean that. Alexander. No, he reached for her, his hands cupping her face. Tell me you don't want this. Tell me you don't think about me every second of the day. Her breath hitched as he pressed his forehead against hers, his grip tightening as if he was afraid she would slip away. Damn him. She did think about him. She craved him. But wanting him didn't make this right. We can't keep doing this, she whispered, closing her eyes. Alexander exhaled sharply, his thumb tracing her lower lip. I can't let you go. A single tear slipped down her cheek. Then don't make me choose. His response wasn't with words, but with his lips crashing onto hers, with his hands sliding into her hair, with his body pressing her against the door as if he could make her forget everything else. And for tonight, she let him, because leaving him would hurt more than breaking the rules. Sophia had always considered herself a woman of control. She prided herself on keeping her emotions in check, on maintaining a firm grip over her life. But with Alexander Reed, she had lost all sense of control. And worse, she had no desire to take it back. The morning after their heated encounter, Sophia arrived at work with a storm raging inside her. She had told herself over and over again that last night was the last time, that she would stop this before it became her downfall. But when she stepped into Alexander's office to deliver his schedule, his gaze burned through her like an unspoken promise. We have a problem, he said, setting down his pen. Her stomach twisted. What kind of problem? Alexander slid a sleek black folder across the desk. Amelia. Sophia stiffened. She had already suspected that Amelia Weston, Alexander's executive assistant, was watching her too closely. But now, the proof was staring her in the face. Inside the folder were printed emails, surveillance reports, and worst of all, a grainy photo of her and Alexander leaving his penthouse together. Sophia's heart pounded. She's spying on us? She's suspicious, Alexander corrected, his tone edged with warning. And Amelia is not someone to underestimate. Sophia sank into the chair, gripping the armrests. What does she want? Alexander's jaw tensed. I don't know, but I'll handle it. Sophia wanted to believe him, but a dangerous thought crept into her mind. What if handling it wasn't enough? What if they were already too deep? That night, Alexander invited her to his penthouse again. You need to relax, he murmured against her ear as his fingers traced slow circles on her bare back. She was sprawled across his bed, his sheets tangled around her naked body. Let me take care of everything. But Sophia couldn't ignore the gnawing fear. I'm scared, Alexander, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He lifted himself onto his elbow, gazing down at her with unreadable eyes. Of what? She swallowed hard. Of losing myself in this. In you. A muscle in his jaw flexed, and for the first time, something vulnerable flickered in his expression. You think I don't feel the same way? His fingers brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. You've consumed me, Sophia. Her breath caught. Then what do we do? Alexander's answer was silent but devastating, his lips capturing hers in a deep, slow kiss, his body pressing her into the mattress as if he could make her forget all the dangers waiting outside this room. And for now, she let him, because despite all the risks, she wasn't ready to let him go. Sophia knew this had to end. But why did it feel like she was ripping her own soul apart? The pressure had been building for days. Amelia no longer hid her suspicions. The sharp looks across the office, the carefully worded questions. She was setting a trap. And today, the trap was sprung. That morning, an anonymous email landed in the inboxes of the company's board of directors. It seems our esteemed CEO is more interested in his assistant than in running a business. Attached was a photo, grainy, but clear enough. Alexander and Sophia, together in his car late at night. Sophia's world came crashing down. Inside Alexander's office, the tension was suffocating. "This is over," Sophia whispered, her voice unsteady. "I have to go." Alexander stood by the window, his fists clenched at his sides.
No.
"Alexander." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with emotion. "I can fix this." "No, you can't," she snapped. "If I stay, they'll destroy you. I won't let that happen." He closed the distance between them in seconds, his hands framing her face. "I don't care about them. I only care about you." Tears burned her eyes. "If you really care about me," she whispered, "you'll let me go." Alexander's jaw tightened, his chest rising and falling heavily. His hands trembled slightly against her skin. But he knew this was the only way. With a shuddering breath, he let her go. "If that's what you want," he said, voice raw, "I won't stop you." Her heart shattered as she turned, forcing herself toward the door. She refused to look back. But before she could grab the handle, his hand caught her wrist, spinning her around. And then his lips crashed onto hers. It wasn't just a kiss.
It was goodbye.
A sob broke from her as she clung to him, letting herself drown in his touch one last time. When they finally pulled away, Alexander rested his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut as if trying to memorize every second. "Sophia," his voice was barely a whisper. But she had already made her choice. With a final, aching glance, she walked away. And this time, nothing stopped her. Weeks later, Sophia sat by the window of a small cafe in a city far from the one she once called home. She should have felt free. Instead, there was an emptiness inside her, one that refused to fade. Her fingers hovered over her phone, scrolling through the contact list until she reached a familiar name. Alexander Reed. For a moment, she considered calling him. But then, with a deep, shaky breath, she locked the screen and set the phone down. They were a fire that burned too bright. And some loves were never meant to last.